For centuries, cotton has been more than just a crop. It has been a weapon of control, a symbol of empire, and a thread binding the world's poorest laborers to the wealth of the richest nations. From the plantations of the colonial era to the glittering fashion houses of today, cotton has carried a hidden story of exploitation and inequality. But recently, something extraordinary happened. Two nations, often dismissed as powerless, Burkina Faso in West Africa and Bangladesh in South Asia, dared to defy the system. Their farmers and factory workers, long overlooked, rose together in resistance. And in a single, unthinkable moment, they shook the very foundations of the global economy. This is the story of the Cotton Rebellion. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded, you must first look back at the system that made it possible. Cotton, one of the world's most traded commodities, has never been about fabric. It has always been about power. In the days of empire, it was the crop that drove colonial expansion, fueling industries in Europe, while entire regions in Africa and Asia were reduced to suppliers of raw material and cheap labor. Generations later, the blueprint of that system remains. Only the faces and the markets have changed. The wealthiest nations of the West continue to dominate fashion and textiles, while the hardest, most grueling labor is carried out in places like Burkina Faso and Bangladesh. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked nation in West Africa, produces some of the finest long staple cotton in the world. Farmers here work under relentless sun, bent over fields, their calloused hands pulling fibers that eventually end up in shirts, dresses, and suits sold for hundreds of dollars in New York, Paris, and London. Yet the irony is brutal. These farmers, the very backbone of the industry, live on just a few dollars a day. They are often forced to sell their cotton at prices set, not in Ouagadougou or even Africa, but in boardrooms in Europe and America. While their cotton is praised for its quality, their lives are marked by struggle, schools without books, clinics without medicine, families barely surviving season to season, thousands of miles away, in the crowded industrial zones of Bangladesh. Another link in the chain continues the cycle of exploitation. Here, textile factories buzz with the sound of thousands of sewing machines. Operated primarily by young women, they stitch and sew for hours that stretch into nights, producing garments that will soon be shipped to Western high streets. Their paychecks are meager, often less than the cost of a single t-shirt they produce. The work is grueling, the air stifling, and the risks very real. Tragedies like factory fires and building collapses have claimed countless lives, briefly grabbing headlines before fading into silence. For the workers, nothing ever truly changes. At first glance, the connection between these two places seems distant, almost invisible. One is a rural farming nation in Africa, the other a manufacturing hub in South Asia. But in reality, they are bound together by the same economic chain, a chain forged by centuries of racial and economic injustice. The cotton that farmers in Burkina Faso grow is exported at unfairly low prices, purchased by multinational corporations. That cotton, once processed, makes its way to factories in Bangladesh, where workers labor endlessly to turn it into finished garments. Those garments are then sold in glossy stores and online platforms across Europe and America, generating billions for corporations, while those at the beginning of the chain remain trapped in poverty. This isn't an accident of economics. It is a system designed to keep power flowing in one direction. The rules of global trade are written to benefit those already wealthy, leaving little room for farmers and workers to break free. For years, both groups accepted it as an unchangeable reality. Farmers grumbled over unfair prices but continued to plant. Workers protested in small numbers but eventually returned to their sewing machines. Their voices were too scattered, too distant, to make a dent in an empire that thrived on their silence. But cracks were beginning to show. Activists started connecting the dots. Economists, journalists, and local leaders began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were Burkina Faso's farmers still trapped in poverty, despite producing some of the best cotton in the world? Why were Bangladesh's workers risking their lives daily while the companies they worked for posted record profits? Beneath the surface, a quiet anger was growing, anger that would soon find its voice. For the first time, whispers of resistance began to echo across both continents. The whispers of discontent did not begin as loud protests or sweeping movements. They started quietly, in hushed conversations under the shade of trees in Burkina Faso, or whispered between tired factory workers. During their rare breaks in Bangladesh, farmers complained about how their cotton fetched prices that barely covered seeds and fertilizer. While Western buyers flaunted their record profits, workers, meanwhile, spoke of exhaustion, of collapsed factories and broken promises, and of wages so low they could not afford decent meals for their children. For a long time, these grievances lived in silence, scattered and powerless. But then, something began to change. In Burkina Faso, farmer cooperatives grew bolder. For decades, small-scale farmers had been forced to sell their cotton individually, leaving them at the mercy of buyers who dictated terms. But slowly, local leaders began organizing them into groups, teaching them the power of collective bargaining. Meetings were held in village squares, under the glow of lanterns after the day's work was done. Farmers who once thought of themselves as powerless began to see themselves as part of something larger. They discussed how cotton prices in the United States and Europe were supported by subsidies, while their governments, burdened with debt, offered little to no help. The unfairness was glaring. Why should their hard labor be worth less simply because of where they lived or the color of their skin? At the same time, in Bangladesh, garment workers were staging small but significant acts of defiance. Sit-ins disrupted production lines. Strikes, though often crushed quickly, forced global brands to acknowledge the unrest. Women, who made up the majority of the workforce, carried much of the movement's weight. They had endured years of harassment, unsafe conditions, and impossible quotas, but their courage only grew. Each small protest planted a seed of resistance. Unions began forming, despite attempts by factory owners to intimidate or dissolve them. NGOs and labor activists connected these struggles to the larger global narrative, reminding workers that their suffering was not an isolated accident, but part of a deliberate system of exploitation. The turning point came when activists and economists began to connect the struggles of Burkina Faso's farmers with those of Bangladesh's workers. Through conferences, social media, and grassroots networks, a narrative emerged. The same corporations that devalued African cotton were the ones exploiting South Asian labor. In one place, the injustice was in the fields. In the other, it was in the factories, but both were connected by a thread of systemic racism and global inequality. This realization was electrifying. Farmers and workers who had long felt isolated realized they were fighting the same enemy. Western corporations noticed the growing unrest. Their first response was predictable: cosmetic reforms. They launched glossy sustainability campaigns, promised fair trade initiatives, and created codes of conduct meant to pacify critics. But on the ground, nothing changed. Farmers still sold their cotton for pennies, and workers still stitched clothes for wages that barely covered rent in crowded slums. The promises felt hollow, and instead of quelling the resistance, they fueled it. Videos of farmers demanding fair pay spread online, alongside images of factory workers locking gates during strike. These images went viral, capturing global attention in ways that corporations could no longer control. The phrase "cotton is ours" began to surface, first in Burkina Faso's local dialects, then in Bengali, and eventually in English. It became a rallying cry, a declaration that the people who grew and stitched the cotton should not remain at the bottom of the economic ladder. Across continents, the slogan resonated. Journalists picked it up, activists amplified it, and soon the cotton rebellion had a name. As momentum built, corporations began to panic. Supply chains are delicate webs, and even minor disruptions can send shockwaves across industries. The idea of farmers refusing to sell or workers halting production terrified executives. Internal memos revealed fears of missed deadlines, stock shortages, and crumbling consumer trust. Investors began asking difficult questions, and brands feared being exposed for the exploitation their profits depended on. For the first time, the balance of power felt unstable, and yet, the rebellion was still fragile. In Burkina Faso, farmers risked losing their only source of income if buyers walked away. In Bangladesh, workers risked retaliation from factory owners, police crackdowns, and the possibility of starvation if they remained unemployed for too long. But something had shifted. For the first time in history, the two most exploited ends of the cotton supply chain were beginning to recognize their collective strength. The stage was set for something unprecedented. The rebellion was no longer whispers in fields or murmurs. On factory floors, it was becoming a movement with the potential to halt an entire industry, and as the corporations scrambled to suppress it, the world watched, waiting to see if the powerless could truly shake the powerful. The storm broke almost overnight, though in truth it had been building for decades. In Burkina Faso, where farmers had spent months preparing, the first strike of defiance was both shocking and symbolic. Instead of quietly handing over their harvests to foreign buyers at the dictated prices, entire farming cooperatives refused to sell. Trucks that normally carried raw cotton to export hubs sat idle. Piles of white fiber, usually whisked away within days, remained stacked high in village courtyards. And then came the image that would circle the globe: farmers standing shoulder to shoulder, torching bales of cotton in protest. For people who relied on this crop for survival, burning it was an almost unthinkable act. Yet that was precisely the point. They were showing the world they were willing to sacrifice everything, rather than remain shackled by injustice stored half a continent away in Bangladesh. The rebellion took on a different form but carried the same spirit. As shipments of cotton stalled from Africa, workers in Dhaka's industrial zones coordinated mass walkouts. Tens of thousands of sewing machines fell silent in unison. Factory floors that had once echoed with the relentless hum of labor turned into empty holes, padlocked from the outside by workers themselves. Millions of garments, already stitched and ready for export, sat abandoned in warehouses. Cargo ships idled at ports, unable to depart without the lifeblood of the supply chain. Timing was no accident. Months of coordination between farmer cooperatives and garment unions had led to this shared rebellion, a strike timed to hit the industry at its weakest point. Just before the global fashion season, Western retailers, who had already invested heavily in advertising campaigns and store launches, now faced the prospect of empty shelves. Panic rippled across boardrooms in Paris, London, and New York. Executives held emergency meetings late into the night, desperate to salvage billions in contracts. What made this moment different from past protests was not just its scale, but its unity. For the first time, two communities that had been separated by oceans and cultures were acting together as one: Burkina Faso's farmers, who grew the cotton, and Bangladesh's workers, who stitched it, had become the twin fists of a single movement. Their combined defiance revealed the fragility of an empire that had long presented itself as invincible. Media coverage exploded. News outlets broadcast images of African farmers with flames rising behind them, juxtaposed with footage of Bangladeshi workers marching through the streets. Social media amplified the movement, making the phrase "cotton is ours" a global hashtag. Consumers, once blind to the origins of their clothing, began asking questions about the true cost of fashion. Why did a shirt sold for $50 in the West leave a farmer in Africa with less than $1, or a Bangladeshi worker with just a few cents? Corporations tried every tactic they knew. They appealed to governments to intervene, warning of economic collapse. They released statements, painting the rebellion as reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous. Some attempted to pit farmers against workers, suggesting that one side was hurting the other, but these efforts fell flat. The solidarity was too strong, the injustices too obvious. For once, the narrative was not controlled by corporations or politicians. It belonged to those who had always been silenced. The economic impact was immediate and devastating for the industry. Stock prices of major fashion houses plummeted within days. Supply chains that had once seemed unstoppable ground to a halt. Investors panicked, fearing the collapse of seasonal launches and long-term damage to brand reputations. For the first time, it became clear that the empire built on cheap cotton and exploited labor could not function without the very people it had spent centuries ignoring. That it was a moment of truth, not just for corporations, but for the global system of trade itself. The rebellion had grown too loud to dismiss, too disruptive to ignore. The powerless had become powerful, and the powerful were left scrambling. The Cotton Rebellion had reached its crescendo, and the world was watching in disbelief as the threads of an empire began to unravel. When the smoke cleared, both literal from the burning bales in Burkina Faso and figurative from the chaos in Bangladesh's streets, the world realized that something irreversible had happened. The Cotton Rebellion was not just a strike or a protest. It was a rewriting of the rules. Western corporations, facing billions in losses and mounting consumer pressure, had no choice but to negotiate. For the first time in history, farmer cooperatives from West Africa sat across from executives in Europe with leverage on their side. Prices were renegotiated, contracts rewritten, and farmers who once earned pennies for their cotton began to see returns that could sustain their families. In Bangladesh, the aftermath carried equal weight. The garment workers, long dismissed as replaceable, had proven their collective power. Their strikes forced factory owners and international buyers to concede to wage increases, improved safety standards, and the legal recognition of unions that could no longer be ignored. The movement did not erase exploitation overnight, nor did it suddenly equalize a deeply unjust global system, but it cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for generations, proving that resistance was not futile, it was transformative. The ripple effects extended far beyond cotton. Analysts warned corporations in coffee, cocoa, and cobalt industries, commodities with similarly exploitative histories, that their supply chains were just as vulnerable. Governments in Africa and Asia began exploring regional alliances to strengthen their bargaining power. Activists called for new international trade standards that valued human dignity over profit margins. Even consumers, who had long been shielded from the realities behind their clothing, could no longer plead ignorance. Hashtags turned into campaigns, campaigns into boycotts, and boycotts into pressure that forced brands to confront their complicity. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Cotton Rebellion was not economic, but symbolic. For centuries, the global story had cast nations like Burkina Faso and Bangladesh as powerless, forever trapped at the bottom of the economic ladder. This rebellion shattered that narrative. It showed that solidarity between the most exploited could shake billion-dollar empires to their core. Farmers and workers, dismissed as invisible, had proven themselves indispensable. The system had depended on their silence, and when that silence broke, the world listened. As history looks back on the Cotton Rebellion, one question continues to linger, echoing across boardrooms, governments, and households alike. If the forgotten and exploited could unite to disrupt the global economy, what else could solidarity achieve? The answer, perhaps, is what the powerful fear most, that the true strength of the global economy has always rested not in boardrooms, but in the calloused hands of those who make it possible.